The UK government just borrowed more money in a single month than at almost any point outside of a pandemic. And if you're thinking, cool, governments borrow money all the time, what's the big deal? Well, you're not alone. Because government debt sounds like the kind of thing that only matters to people who read the Financial Times on a Saturday morning and use the word fiscal in casual conversation. But here's the thing. Hidden inside Britain's borrowing figures is a story that directly affects your mortgage rate, your pension, your tax bill, and the price of everything you buy. And for the first time in decades, the numbers are starting to flash a warning that the people in charge would very much prefer you didn't notice. So to understand what's actually happening, we need to back up, and we need to start with one number, £3.1 trillion. That is the current stock of UK public sector net debt. To put that into something resembling human language, that is roughly 100% of everything the entire British economy produces in a single year. Every good, every service, every hour worked, every cup of coffee sold. 1 full year of the entire country's economic output, and we owe it all. Now, debt at 100% of GDP sounds catastrophic, but on its own, it isn't necessarily. Japan has been sitting above 200% for years and hasn't collapsed. So the number itself isn't the story. What matters is the trajectory, the speed, and whether the people lending you the money still believe you're good for it. And on all three of those measures, the picture for Britain is getting harder to defend. Because UK government borrowing has now exceeded official forecasts for 4 consecutive years. The Office for Budget Responsibility, which is the independent body responsible for telling the government whether its numbers add up, has had to revise its projections upward every single time.
And not by a little, by tens of billions of pounds. Which raises an obvious question. At what point does a forecast become a fiction? But before we get into why this is happening and what it means, it's worth taking 60 seconds to explain how government borrowing actually works, because the mechanism behind it is the real story. When the UK government spends more than it collects in taxes, it has to make up the difference, and it does that by issuing gilts. A gilt is just a bond. It's a piece of paper the government sells to investors. In exchange, the government promises to pay back the face value at a fixed future date and to make regular interest payments in the meantime. The investors who buy these gilts are pension funds, insurance companies, foreign central banks, and sovereign wealth funds, the big institutional money. And the interest rate they demand before they'll buy one of those gilts is called the gilt yield. And here's the relationship that matters. If investors trust that Britain will pay them back, they'll accept a lower yield. Low risk, lower return. But if they start to doubt it, if they start to wonder whether Britain's finances are sustainable, they demand a higher yield before they'll lend. More risk, more return. And when gilt yields rise, the cost of servicing Britain's debt rises with it.
The UK 10-year gilt yield has been climbing, and in January of this year, it hit its highest level since 2008. The 30-year gilt yield touched levels not seen since 1998. And while financial media was busy explaining this away as a global phenomenon, a side effect of higher rates everywhere, there was something specific happening to Britain that wasn't happening in quite the same way elsewhere. Because the gilt market wasn't just repricing British debt in line with global rates, it was adding a premium, a UK-specific risk premium. The kind of premium investors demand when they're not entirely sure the borrower has things under control. And we've seen this before, because in September 2022, something happened in Britain's gilt market that had never happened before. Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng announced a mini-budget, £45 billion of unfunded tax cuts, with no explanation of how they'd be paid for. And the bond market responded in a way that felt less like a market correction and more like a warning shot. Gilt yields spiked so violently and so fast that pension funds across the country were hours away from collapse.
The Bank of England had to step in with emergency bond purchases to prevent a full systemic meltdown. A sitting Prime Minister was effectively fired by the bond market. It took 45 days. Now, we're not in that moment, but the structure of what's happening right now rhymes with it. And the reason it rhymes is because the underlying problem was never actually fixed. It was managed. And there's a difference.
Because here's what people don't talk about when they talk about UK debt. The headline number of £3.1 trillion is already eye-watering, but it doesn't include everything. It doesn't include the full cost of state pension obligations. It doesn't include the unfunded liabilities sitting inside public sector defined benefit pension schemes. The teachers, the nurses, the civil servants, all promised a pension based on their final salary, all to be paid out of future tax revenues, all sitting off the official balance sheet.
And then there's the interest bill, because this is where the structure of UK debt becomes genuinely unusual and genuinely expensive. Around a quarter of UK government debt is index-linked, which means the interest payments and the principal owed are tied to inflation. When inflation was low and predictable, this was manageable. When inflation surged to over 11% in 2022, the cost of servicing that index-linked debt surged with it, which is why UK debt interest payments hit £100 billion in a single year for the first time ever. To put that in context, that's more than the UK spends on defence, more than it spends on transport, roughly the same as the entire education budget, just to service the interest on existing debt before a single new penny is borrowed.
And this is where it gets interesting, because the government knows this, the OBR knows this, the Bank of England knows this, and their answer, the official answer, is that this is under control, that the fiscal rules are intact, that the debt to GDP ratio will stabilise and then fall within the forecast period. But here's the thing about fiscal rules. Britain has changed them before. In fact, the current government changed the definition of the debt measure it uses to give itself more headroom within months of taking office, which is the political equivalent of moving the goalposts and then claiming you're still on track to score. And the headroom itself, the buffer between where debt is projected to land and where the fiscal rules say it has to land, is razor thin. The OBR has estimated it at around £9 billion, which sounds like a lot until you consider that a single set of worse-than-expected growth figures, a colder-than-average winter, a shock to the global economy, any one of those things wipes it out entirely. And the global economy right now is not short of shocks. Because sitting behind all of this is a problem that Britain shares with every major Western economy, but feels more acutely than most: growth. The UK economy has been one of the weakest performers in the G7 over the past 15 years. Productivity growth has been anemic, business investment has lagged, and the post-pandemic recovery has been slower and shallower than in comparable economies. And this matters for the debt story, because the only sustainable way out of a high debt situation is to grow your way out of it. If the economy grows faster than the debt grows, the ratio falls, and the problem becomes more manageable over time. But if growth stays low and borrowing stays high, the ratio doesn't fall. It drifts higher, and at some point, the market notices. There are already signs it's noticing.
The pound has been under pressure. Sterling has underperformed against the dollar and the euro in periods of gilt market stress, and foreign investors, the pension funds and sovereign wealth funds and central banks that Britain relies on to show up at every gilt auction and keep buying, have been watching. Because there is a version of this story where they keep showing up, where the yields stabilise, where growth picks up, the OBR forecasts prove right, and Britain muddles through the way it usually does. But there is another version. And in that version, the cost of borrowing keeps rising, the interest bill keeps growing, the headroom keeps shrinking, and at some point the government faces a choice it has no good answer to. Raise taxes on an already squeezed population, cut spending on services that are already under severe strain,
or borrow more and hope the market keeps playing along. And the market, as Liz Truss discovered, does not always play along. Now, here's the part that should matter to you personally. Gilt yields are the anchor for mortgage rates in the UK. When gilt yields rise, fixed-rate mortgage deals get more expensive.
And in a country where millions of homeowners are remortgaging every 2 to 3 years after fixed-term deals expire, a sustained rise in gilt yields feeds directly into household finances. Not in 6 years, in months. Higher gilt yields also affect pension funds. UK pension funds hold enormous quantities of gilts. When yields move sharply, the value of those holdings moves too. We saw in 2022 what happens when that move is violent enough, and the liability-driven investment strategies that nearly blew up pension funds that year haven't disappeared. They've been reformed, but the underlying exposure is still there. And then there's the tax question, because if the debt trajectory doesn't improve, and the interest bill keeps rising, and the fiscal headroom stays razor-thin, the pressure to raise revenue doesn't go away. It builds. Which means at some point, this lands on someone's tax bill. And historically speaking, in Britain, that someone tends to be the people who can least afford to absorb it.
There's a quote from the former governor of the Bank of England, Mervyn King, that stuck with me while I was putting this together. He said that the UK's fiscal position was, in his words, the most challenging it has faced in peacetime. He said that in 2010, before the pandemic, before the energy crisis, before the index-linked debt bill hit £100 billion, the situation he was describing then is structurally more difficult now. And yet, the official line remains the same. It's manageable, it's under control, the rules are intact. And maybe it is. Maybe the growth comes through, maybe inflation falls cleanly, maybe the gilt market stays calm and the headroom holds and none of the worst scenarios materialise. But the bond market is not a place where people get rewarded for giving governments the benefit of the doubt. And right now, the price of insuring against UK government debt, the credit default swap market, has been quietly ticking higher. When you see that, it's worth asking why.
Because you can paper over the numbers in a budget statement. You can change the definition of the debt measure. You can revise the forecast. But the math is still the math. And bad math doesn't just disappear.